So my golden child brother basically stole thousands from our dying grandmother and tried to pin it on me. For years, I watched my parents worship the ground he walked on while treating me like I was invisible. Every family dinner was the same. They'd ignore my promotions and achievements while celebrating his latest excuse for why he couldn't hold down a job. I thought I was stuck being the family scapegoat forever. But when I discovered he was draining Grandma's accounts and forging my signature on withdrawal slips, I finally had enough evidence to expose him. The look on my parents' faces when I laid out all the proof was worth decades of being overlooked. So I'm Alex, 28M, accountant/financial analyst. I work for a mid-sized firm downtown, and honestly, I love my job. Numbers make sense to me in a way that family dynamics never have. I've been dealing with being the family disappointment for as long as I can remember, even though objectively, I'm doing pretty well for myself. My brother Marcus is 30 and has been the golden child since we were kids. Doesn't matter that I graduated summa cum laude while he barely finished high school. Doesn't matter that I have a stable career while he bounces between odd jobs and unemployment. My parents still act like he hung the moon, and I'm just some afterthought. The worst part is how obvious it is during family gatherings. I could announce I got a huge promotion, and they'd give me a polite nod before turning to ask Marcus about his latest get-rich-quick scheme. I've learned to just keep my mouth shut and endure it. Our grandmother has always been different, though. She's the only family member who ever really saw me for who I am. Even now at 84, living in assisted care, she remembers every detail about my work and asks genuine questions about my life. She's been declining lately, which has the whole family on edge. What I didn't know at the time was that Marcus had been taking advantage of her condition in ways that would make my years of being overlooked seem trivial by comparison. Monday evening family dinner at my parents' house was going exactly as expected. I had just finished telling them about landing a major client that would probably lead to a partnership track position, and my mom gave me the usual half-hearted response about how nice that was. Then Marcus walked in 20 minutes late, looking disheveled and jumpy. My parents immediately shifted all their attention to him, asking if he was okay and fussing over whether he'd eaten. He mumbled something about traffic and slumped into his chair across from me. My dad started his usual interrogation about Marcus's job search, but in the gentlest possible way. He asked if Marcus had heard back from any of the applications they'd helped him submit last week. Marcus just shrugged and said he was waiting to hear back from a few places. I noticed he kept checking his phone throughout dinner, which was unusual even for him. Every time it buzzed, he'd glance at it quickly and then put it face down on the table. His leg was bouncing under the table too, making the whole thing shake slightly. My mom brought up Grandma's upcoming birthday and asked if we should plan something special. Marcus immediately perked up and suggested we should ask her what she wanted. He said he'd been visiting her more often lately and that she seemed lonely. That surprised me because Marcus usually avoided visiting Grandma. She had a way of asking pointed questions about his life that made him uncomfortable. I asked him when he'd started visiting regularly, and he got defensive. He said he didn't realize he needed to check with me about spending time with his own grandmother. My parents jumped to his defense, saying it was wonderful that he was being so attentive. My dad mentioned that Grandma had told him Marcus had been helping her with some paperwork and errands. He seemed proud that Marcus was finally showing some responsibility. The whole conversation felt off to me. Marcus kept fidgeting with his napkin and avoiding eye contact. When my mom asked about the specific errands he'd been helping with, he gave vague answers about organizing her files and helping her understand her bills. I tried to contribute to the conversation by mentioning that I'd been meaning to visit Grandma more often myself, maybe help her review her finances since that's what I do for a living. Marcus immediately shot that down, saying she didn't need any help and that too many people getting involved would just confuse her. The way he said it struck me as strange. Since when did Marcus care about protecting Grandma from confusion? And why would he assume that my professional expertise would be more confusing than his random help? After dinner, as we were clearing the table, Marcus excused himself to take a phone call outside. Through the window, I could see him pacing back and forth on the front lawn, gesturing animatedly. The conversation looked heated, and at one point he ran his hands through his hair in what looked like frustration. When he came back inside, he announced he had to leave early. He hugged my parents goodbye and told them he'd call them tomorrow. As he was leaving, I heard him tell my dad that he might need to borrow some money next week for a security deposit on an apartment he was looking at. My dad immediately offered to help, saying they could discuss the details later. Marcus thanked him and left quickly, still seeming agitated and distracted. After he was gone, my parents spent the rest of the evening talking about how proud they were that Marcus was finally getting his life together. They speculated about the apartment he mentioned and wondered if this meant he was ready to settle down. I sat there listening to them plan ways to support his latest venture, knowing they'd never shown that level of enthusiasm for any of my actual accomplishments. But something about the whole evening bothered me beyond the usual family dynamics. Marcus's behavior had been genuinely strange, and his sudden interest in helping Grandma felt completely out of character. Wednesday afternoon, I decided to visit Grandma at Sunset Manor, her assisted living facility. I hadn't seen her in a couple of weeks, and Marcus's comments about her seeming lonely had stuck with me. Plus, I wanted to see for myself what kind of help he'd been providing. When I arrived, I found Grandma in her usual spot in the common room, working on a crossword puzzle. She lit up when she saw me, which always made me feel better about everything else in my life. She asked about work and actually listened to my answers, unlike certain other family members. We chatted for a while about my job and her activities at the facility. She seemed sharp and engaged, which made me wonder why Marcus thought she needed so much help with her paperwork. I casually brought up his recent visits, and she looked confused for a moment. She told me that Marcus had been coming by, but she wasn't sure why he was so interested in her financial documents. She said he'd asked to see her bank statements and checkbooks several times, claiming he wanted to make sure she wasn't being taken advantage of by the facility. That raised a red flag for me immediately. Grandma had always been extremely private about her finances, and she was still mentally sharp enough to handle her own affairs. I asked her if she'd actually shown him the documents, and she said she had because she didn't want to seem ungrateful for his concern. I suggested we could review her finances together if she was worried about anything. She seemed relieved by the offer and asked if I could help her understand why her bank balance seemed lower than she expected. She said she'd been meaning to call the bank, but kept forgetting. We went to her room to look at her recent statements. She kept them in a small filing box on her desk, organized by month. As I flipped through the papers, I immediately noticed several large withdrawals over the past 6 weeks. Each one was for amounts between $800 and $1,500. The withdrawals were all made at ATMs, which seemed strange since Grandma rarely used cash for anything significant. When I asked her about them, she looked genuinely confused. She said she couldn't remember making any large cash withdrawals recently. I asked if she'd given her ATM card to anyone or shared her PIN. She shook her head and said she'd never do that. But then she mentioned that Marcus had offered to help her with banking errands and had asked about her PIN number. She said she'd written it down for him in case of emergencies. My stomach dropped. I asked her to show me where she'd written the PIN, and she pulled out a small notebook from her desk drawer. The page with her banking information had been torn out. At that point, I was starting to piece together a very concerning picture. I told Grandma I wanted to help her get to the bottom of the missing money, and she agreed to let me contact the bank on her behalf. She signed a form giving me permission to discuss her account with them. While I was helping her organize her papers, one of the facility staff members knocked on the door. It was Janet, who worked in the business office. She asked if everything was okay because she'd noticed some unusual activity on Grandma's account. Janet explained that they'd received calls from Grandma's bank about large cash withdrawals that seemed out of pattern for her usual spending habits. The bank had flagged the account for potential elder abuse and wanted to verify that Grandma was making the withdrawals herself. I told Janet that we were looking into the same issue and asked if she could provide any additional information. She said that Marcus had been visiting during times when the withdrawals were made, and that he'd asked several questions about Grandma's financial procedures. Janet also mentioned that Marcus had specifically asked about when Grandma received her monthly pension and Social Security deposits. She'd found it odd because family members usually didn't need those details unless they were helping with financial planning. By the time I left that afternoon, I had a growing suspicion that Marcus was stealing from Grandma. The timing of his visits, his sudden interest in her finances, and the missing PIN information all pointed to the same conclusion. But I needed more evidence before I could make any accusations. I promised Grandma I'd help her figure out what was happening with her money. She thanked me and said she'd been worried but hadn't wanted to bother anyone with her concerns. That broke my heart because it was so typical of her to put everyone else's comfort before her own well-being. Friday morning, I took a personal day from work to investigate further. I wanted to visit Grandma again and see if I could gather more concrete evidence before jumping to conclusions. I also planned to speak with the facility's security team about their visitor logs. I arrived at Sunset Manor around 10 a.m. and went straight to the administrative office. I explained to the director, Mrs. Patterson, that I was concerned about potential financial abuse of my grandmother. She took my concerns seriously and agreed to help however she could. Mrs. Patterson pulled up their visitor logs and showed me the records for the past 2 months. Marcus's name appeared frequently, often on weekdays during business hours when most family members would be working. The timing coincided almost perfectly with the dates of the suspicious withdrawals. She also mentioned that their security cameras had captured some unusual behavior from Marcus during his visits. She offered to review the footage with me if I thought it would be helpful. I definitely wanted to see it. We went to the security office where the head of security, Mr. Rodriguez, pulled up the relevant footage. The first video showed Marcus arriving on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks ago. He went directly to Grandma's room and stayed for about 30 minutes. What was interesting was what happened when he left. Instead of going straight to the parking lot, he made a detour to the business office area. The camera showed him looking around to make sure no one was watching, then approaching the bulletin board where they posted information about local banks and ATM locations. The next video was from the following day. Marcus was shown leaving the facility at 2:15 p.m. and then returning about an hour later. Mr. Rodriguez told me that the nearest ATM was about 15 minutes away, which would fit the timeline perfectly. In the third video, from just last week, Marcus appeared agitated when he arrived. He went to Grandma's room for only 10 minutes before leaving abruptly. As he walked through the lobby, he was clearly talking on his phone and looked stressed. While we were reviewing the footage, Mr. Rodriguez got a call on his radio. Marcus was in the building right now, heading toward Grandma's room. I asked if I could observe from a distance to see how he behaved during his visit. We positioned ourselves where we could see down the hallway toward Grandma's room. Marcus knocked and went inside, and we could hear voices but not make out the conversation. After about 5 minutes, the voices got louder and Marcus sounded frustrated. I couldn't make out the exact words, but I heard Grandma's voice getting firmer, like she was refusing something. Then Marcus came out of the room looking angry and walked quickly toward the exit. I waited a few minutes before going to check on Grandma. She was sitting on her bed looking upset and confused. She told me that Marcus had just been there asking for her ATM card again. She said he claimed he needed to make a deposit for her, but she told him she didn't have any deposits to make. She also said he'd seemed different lately, more pushy and impatient. She asked if I thought something was wrong with him because his behavior was making her uncomfortable. I reassured her that she'd done the right thing by not giving him the card. I suggested that maybe we should keep her ATM card somewhere safe, and she agreed to let me put it in the facility's safe for now. Before I left, I asked Mrs. Patterson if she could provide me with copies of the visitor logs and security footage. She said she'd need to check with their legal department first, but that she'd try to accommodate my request given the circumstances. I also asked her to flag Grandma's account so that staff would be notified if anyone other than Grandma herself tried to access her financial information or personal belongings. On my way out, I ran into Janet from the business office. She told me that Marcus had just stopped by asking if they'd heard from the bank about Grandma's account. She'd told him that any communication from the bank would go directly to Grandma or her authorized representatives. Marcus had pressed her for more details about who was authorized to handle Grandma's finances. When she explained that it was typically only the account holder unless there was a power of attorney, he'd asked how someone would go about getting that authorization. Janet said the conversation had made her uncomfortable because it seemed like Marcus was fishing for information about how to gain access to Grandma's accounts. She'd kept her responses vague and suggested he speak directly with Grandma about any concerns. By the time I left the facility, I was convinced that Marcus was stealing from Grandma, but I also realized that he might be getting desperate, which could make him more dangerous. I needed to move quickly to protect her and gather enough evidence to stop him permanently. Saturday afternoon, my parents had planned a family barbecue, which meant another opportunity to observe Marcus's behavior. I arrived early to help with setup, hoping to have some time to gauge the family mood before things got complicated. My parents were in good spirits, excited about having both their sons over for the afternoon. My mom had made Marcus's favorite potato salad, and my dad had bought the expensive steaks that Marcus always requested. The favoritism was as obvious as ever. When Marcus arrived, he seemed more on edge than he'd been at dinner earlier in the week. He was constantly checking his phone and kept stepping outside to take calls. Each time he came back inside, he looked more stressed. I decided to carefully probe the topic of Grandma's finances during lunch. I mentioned that I'd visited her recently and that she'd seemed worried about some bank statements. I said I'd offered to help her review them since financial analysis was my specialty. Marcus immediately jumped in, saying that Grandma was getting confused about her finances and that too many people getting involved would just make things worse. He insisted that he'd been helping her organize everything and that she didn't need additional assistance. My dad agreed with Marcus, saying it was good that someone was looking out for Grandma's interests. My mom added that it was sweet how much time Marcus had been spending with her lately. I pressed a little further, asking if anyone had noticed anything unusual about Grandma's spending patterns. Marcus got defensive and asked why I was suddenly so interested in Grandma's money. He suggested that maybe I should focus on my own finances instead of worrying about hers. The accusation stung, especially coming in front of our parents. But it also confirmed my suspicions that Marcus was feeling cornered. Innocent people don't usually get that defensive about legitimate questions. After lunch, while my parents were cleaning up, Marcus pulled me aside. He told me that he'd heard I'd been asking questions at Grandma's facility and that I was making the staff suspicious of the family. He said I needed to back off before I caused problems for everyone. I asked him what kind of problems he was worried about, and he said that facilities like that were always looking for reasons to restrict family access. He claimed that my questions about finances could make them think the family was trying to exploit Grandma. The conversation felt like a warning, and I realized that Marcus knew I was onto him. He was trying to preemptively discredit me before I could expose what he'd been doing. Later that afternoon, while Marcus was outside on another phone call, I helped my mom clean up the kitchen. She mentioned that Marcus had seemed stressed lately and asked if I'd noticed anything. I said he did seem different, and she wondered if he was having money troubles again. That gave me an opening to ask about the apartment he'd mentioned needing a security deposit for. My mom said they'd offered to help him with the deposit, but that he'd been vague about the details. She seemed worried that he might be getting involved in another scheme that would fall through. After everyone left, I went home and found something that made my blood run cold. In my mailbox was an envelope addressed to me from Grandma's bank. Inside was a letter stating that there had been suspicious activity on an account linked to my Social Security number. The letter mentioned that someone had attempted to add me as an authorized user on my grandmother's account without proper documentation. The bank was requesting that I contact them immediately to verify whether I had made this request. I called the bank's fraud department right away and spoke with a representative who explained the situation in more detail. Someone had submitted paperwork attempting to add me to Grandma's account as a joint account holder, using forged documents that included my signature. The representative said they'd flagged the request because the signature didn't match the one they had on file for me from my own accounts at the same bank. They'd also found it suspicious that the request came just days after several large cash withdrawals from the account. I told the representative that I had not made any such request, and that I suspected my grandmother was being financially abused by a family member. She assured me that they would investigate and that they'd already frozen the account to prevent further unauthorized access. She also mentioned that they had security camera footage from the ATM transactions and that the person making the withdrawals clearly wasn't my elderly grandmother. She said they'd be happy to provide this evidence to law enforcement if I decided to file a report. By the time I hung up, I realized that Marcus hadn't just been stealing from Grandma. He'd been trying to frame me for it. The forged documents with my signature were probably his backup plan in case he got caught. He could claim that I was the one with access to the account and that he'd just been trying to help. Sunday through Tuesday became a frantic period of evidence gathering. I knew I was running out of time because Marcus was clearly getting desperate, and I needed to build an airtight case before he could do more damage or successfully frame me. My first stop Monday morning was back to the bank. I met with their fraud investigator, Ms. Chun, who showed me copies of the forged documents. The signature was a decent attempt at copying mine, but there were subtle differences that a handwriting expert would easily catch. Ms. Chun also provided me with printed records of all the suspicious transactions, including timestamps and ATM locations. The pattern was clear. Withdrawals were always made during times when Marcus had signed in at Grandma's facility, and always from ATMs within a few miles of Sunset Manor. She gave me a USB drive containing the ATM security footage, warning me that it clearly showed Marcus making the withdrawals using what appeared to be Grandma's card. The video quality was good enough to make a positive identification. Tuesday morning, I took another personal day to continue investigating. I decided to follow up on Marcus's suspicious phone calls and general agitated behavior. If he was stealing to support a drug habit, there might be additional evidence I could find. I started by driving past his apartment complex around the time I'd usually see him leaving for his supposed job interviews. Instead of leaving for interviews, I saw him meeting with someone in the parking lot who definitely didn't look like a potential employer. The meeting lasted about 10 minutes, and I watched Marcus hand over what looked like cash in exchange for a small package. The other person left immediately afterward, and Marcus went back to his apartment looking relieved. I managed to get the license plate number of the other person's car and decided to see if I could find out more about them. It took some creative internet searching, but I eventually found social media profiles that suggested this person had multiple drug-related arrests. That afternoon, I received a call from my mom that made my heart race. She told me that the family was planning an intervention for me on Wednesday evening. She said they were worried about my recent behavior and that Marcus had expressed concerns about my mental state. According to my mom, Marcus had told them that I'd been harassing Grandma and the facility staff with paranoid questions about finances. He'd suggested that I might be having some kind of breakdown related to work stress. My mom said they'd arranged for a family therapist to be present for the intervention and that they hoped to help me get the support I needed. She assured me that they loved me and just wanted what was best for my well-being. I realized that Marcus was trying to preemptively discredit me before I could expose him. By painting me as mentally unstable, he could dismiss any evidence I presented as the delusions of someone having a breakdown. That evening, I got a text message that changed everything. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the content made it clear it was meant for Marcus. The message read. I screenshot the message immediately and then realized what had happened. Marcus must have given someone my phone number by mistake, probably because our numbers were similar or he'd mixed up his contacts while high. I decided to play along and responded as if I was Marcus. The response came back quickly. This gave me the final piece of the puzzle. Marcus wasn't just stealing from Grandma for general expenses. He owed money to dangerous people and was desperate to pay them back. I spent Tuesday night organizing all my evidence into a comprehensive package. I had bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawals, security footage from both the facility and the ATMs, the forged documents with my signature, and now text messages proving Marcus's drug-related debts. I also prepared a timeline that showed exactly how Marcus had gained access to Grandma's financial information, when he'd made each withdrawal, and how he'd tried to cover his tracks by framing me. Wednesday morning, I called Mrs. Patterson at the facility and asked if she could arrange for Grandma to be present at my parents' house that evening. I explained that I had important information about her finances that the whole family needed to hear. I also contacted the bank's fraud department and asked them to have a representative available by phone during the evening in case we needed to verify any of the evidence. By Wednesday afternoon, I was as prepared as I could be. I had multiple copies of all the evidence, backup files stored in the cloud, and a clear plan for how to present everything. I knew that Marcus would try to deflect and deny, but the evidence was overwhelming. The hardest part was knowing that this would destroy my parents' image of their golden child. But Grandma deserved justice, and I deserved to clear my name before Marcus could successfully frame me for his crimes. Wednesday evening, I arrived at my parents' house to find everyone already assembled in the living room. My parents were sitting together on the couch looking worried, while Marcus sat across from them in the armchair. Grandma was in her wheelchair next to the couch, looking confused about why she'd been brought over. The family therapist, Dr. Williams, introduced herself and explained that interventions were most effective when everyone felt safe to express their concerns openly. She asked me to sit down so we could begin. My mom started by telling me how much they loved me and how worried they'd become about my recent behavior. She said that Marcus had shared some concerning observations about my interactions with Grandma and the facility staff. Marcus jumped in, saying that he'd noticed me becoming increasingly paranoid and fixated on Grandma's finances. He claimed that I'd been harassing the staff with wild accusations and making Grandma anxious with my questions. He suggested that work stress might be affecting my judgment and that I might benefit from some time off and professional counseling. His performance was convincing. He sounded genuinely concerned and spoke with the kind of measured tone that made him seem reasonable. Dr. Williams asked me how I was feeling about these concerns, and I told her that I appreciated everyone's worry, but that I had some important information to share first. I said that I discovered some serious issues with Grandma's finances that the family needed to know about. Marcus immediately objected, saying that this was exactly the kind of paranoid thinking they were trying to address. He told Dr. Williams that I'd been obsessing over Grandma's money and seeing conspiracies where none existed. I pulled out my folder of evidence and asked everyone to please look at the bank statements before making any judgments. I handed copies to my parents and Dr. Williams, explaining that these showed unauthorized withdrawals from Grandma's account. My dad studied the statements and asked Grandma if she remembered making these large cash withdrawals. She shook her head and said she rarely used cash for anything significant. She looked genuinely confused about the transactions. Marcus tried to explain that elderly people often forget their financial transactions and that Grandma had probably just forgotten about the withdrawals. He suggested that my accusations were causing her unnecessary distress. That's when I pulled out the ATM security footage on my laptop. I played the first video, which clearly showed Marcus using an ATM card at the time and location of one of the withdrawals. The image quality was good enough that there was no question about his identity. The room went completely silent. My parents stared at the screen in shock, while Marcus's face went pale. He started stammering that there must be some explanation, that maybe he'd been helping Grandma with errands. I played 2 more videos from different dates, each showing Marcus making withdrawals from Grandma's account. Then I showed them the visitor logs from the facility, demonstrating that each withdrawal coincided with one of his visits. Dr. Williams asked Marcus if he could explain why he was using his grandmother's ATM card. He claimed that Grandma had asked him to help her with banking errands because she was having trouble getting around. That's when I pulled out the forged documents with my signature. I explained that someone had tried to add me to Grandma's account without my knowledge, using fake authorization forms. The bank had caught the forgery because the signature didn't match their records. I told them about the bank's investigation and how they'd frozen the account to prevent further unauthorized access. I also mentioned that the bank had offered to provide evidence to law enforcement if we decided to press charges. Marcus became more agitated and accused me of orchestrating an elaborate scheme to make him look guilty. He suggested that I might have made the withdrawals myself and then fabricated evidence to frame him. That's when I played my final card, the text messages. I read aloud the threatening messages about overdue payments and explained how I'd received them by mistake when someone confused our phone numbers. I showed them Marcus's responses, where he'd acknowledged the debt and asked for more time to pay. The messages made it clear that he owed money to dangerous people and was desperate for cash. Grandma spoke up for the first time since the evidence presentation began. She said that Marcus had been asking her increasingly pushy questions about her finances and that she'd been uncomfortable with his behavior. She confirmed that she'd never authorized him to use her ATM card or access her account. My parents sat in stunned silence, looking back and forth between the evidence and Marcus. My dad finally asked Marcus directly if he'd been stealing from Grandma, and Marcus broke down completely. He admitted that he'd been taking money from Grandma's account, but insisted that he'd planned to pay it back. He said he'd gotten into debt with some bad people and had panicked when they started threatening him. He claimed that he'd only meant to borrow the money temporarily and that the forged documents were just a backup plan in case anyone asked questions. He insisted that he'd never intended to hurt Grandma or frame me permanently. Dr. Williams asked how much money he'd taken, and Marcus admitted it was over $8,000. He said he'd been planning to get a job and pay it back gradually, but that his creditors weren't willing to wait. The room erupted as my parents processed the full scope of what Marcus had done. My mom started crying, and my dad looked like he'd been physically hit. Grandma just sat quietly, looking sad and betrayed. Thursday morning brought a flurry of activity as the family tried to figure out how to handle the crisis. My parents had barely slept, and when I arrived at their house, they looked like they'd aged years overnight. My dad had already been on the phone with the bank, trying to understand the process for recovering the stolen money. The bank representative had explained that they could reverse some of the transactions, but that a police report would be necessary for full restitution. My mom was struggling with the decision about whether to press charges against Marcus. She kept saying that he was sick and needed help, not punishment. She worried that involving the police would destroy his chances of getting his life together. I understood her maternal instincts, but I also knew that Marcus had committed serious crimes. He'd stolen from a vulnerable elderly person and had tried to frame me for his actions. The consequences needed to match the severity of what he'd done. Dr. Williams had recommended that we take some time to process everything before making any major decisions. She'd given us resources for family therapy and addiction counseling, emphasizing that healing would take time for everyone involved. Marcus had spent the night at my parents' house, sleeping in his old room while my dad kept his car keys. He looked terrible when he finally came downstairs, hollow-eyed and shaky, like he was going through withdrawal. When I saw him, all the anger I'd been suppressing came flooding out. I told him that he'd not only stolen from the one person who'd always been kind to him, but that he'd tried to destroy my reputation to cover his tracks. He apologized repeatedly, saying that he'd been desperate and hadn't been thinking clearly. He claimed that the drugs had made him paranoid and that he'd convinced himself I was trying to take over Grandma's finances. I asked him how long he'd been using, and he admitted it had been going on for over a year. He said it had started with prescription painkillers after a work injury, but had escalated to harder drugs when the pills became too expensive. My parents were learning details about Marcus's life that they'd never suspected. They'd thought his job instability was due to bad luck or lack of opportunity, not because he'd been fired for drug-related issues. Friday afternoon, we had a family meeting to decide on next steps. Grandma was there again, and she surprised everyone by being the voice of reason. She said that Marcus needed serious help and that protecting him from consequences wouldn't actually help him recover. She also said that she wanted her money back and that she deserved to feel safe in her own living situation. The theft had made her question whether she could trust any family member with access to her personal information. My dad stepped up in a way I'd never seen before. He told Marcus that the family would support him through treatment, but that he had to face the legal consequences of his actions. He said they'd help him find a good lawyer and a reputable rehab program. He also apologized to me for not believing me initially and for allowing the family dynamics to become so unbalanced over the years. He admitted that their favoritism toward Marcus had been unfair and had probably enabled his destructive behavior. My mom was still struggling with the decision to involve law enforcement, but she agreed that Marcus needed professional help that the family couldn't provide alone. She said she'd support whatever legal action was necessary if it meant getting him into a proper treatment program. We spent the weekend researching rehab facilities and legal options. Marcus was cooperative throughout the process, seeming almost relieved that his secrets were finally out in the open. By Sunday evening, we'd found a residential treatment program that specialized in addiction and had experience working with clients who had legal issues. The program director explained that many of their patients were dealing with criminal charges related to their substance abuse. Marcus agreed to enter the program immediately, and my dad arranged to drive him there Monday morning. We also scheduled a meeting with a criminal defense attorney who specialized in cases involving addiction and family situations. The attorney explained that Marcus's cooperation and immediate entry into treatment would likely result in more lenient sentencing. She thought there was a good chance he could avoid jail time if he completed the program successfully and made full restitution. Throughout this process, I found myself feeling conflicted about Marcus's situation. I was still angry about what he'd done, but I could also see that he was genuinely struggling with addiction. The brother I'd grown up with was still in there somewhere, buried under years of poor choices and substance abuse. 1 month later, we were all sitting in Dr. Williams's office for our first official family therapy session. Marcus was still in residential treatment, but he'd been allowed to participate via video call for this important conversation. The session was focused on addressing the years of family dysfunction that had contributed to our current crisis. Dr. Williams had asked each of us to prepare by thinking about patterns in our family relationships that might have enabled Marcus's behavior. My parents went first, acknowledging that their favoritism toward Marcus had been obvious and harmful to both of their sons. My mom admitted that she'd made excuses for Marcus's behavior because she was afraid of losing him, but that her enabling had actually made his problems worse. My dad talked about how his own childhood had shaped his parenting style. He'd grown up with very critical parents and had overcorrected by being too lenient with Marcus. He realized that his attempts to boost Marcus's self-esteem had backfired by removing natural consequences for poor choices. When it was my turn, I talked about how being the family scapegoat had affected my self-worth and relationships. I explained that I'd learned to expect disappointment from family interactions and had stopped trying to compete for their attention years ago. I also admitted that I'd harbored resentment toward Marcus for years, even before the theft incident. Watching him receive unconditional support while I had to earn every bit of recognition had created a lot of anger that I'd never properly addressed. Marcus participated from his treatment facility, looking healthier than he had in months. He apologized again for the theft and for trying to frame me, but this time his apology felt more genuine and thoughtful. He talked about how the drugs had affected his thinking and made him paranoid about everyone's motives. He said he'd convinced himself that I was trying to take over Grandma's finances because he couldn't believe that anyone would help her without ulterior motives. He also acknowledged that he'd taken advantage of our parents' favoritism and had never learned to handle disappointment or failure in healthy ways. He said the treatment program was helping him understand how his childhood experiences had contributed to his addictive behaviors. Dr. Williams guided us through some exercises designed to improve communication and establish healthier boundaries. She emphasized that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent effort from everyone involved.